Next up, we've got Chad Berginnis, who is now with the ASFPM as the executive director. And, oops, did I do that? Okay. Chad has been with the ASFPM since 2011, and as I said, is currently the executive director. Before that, he's worked in several different areas. He's been at the local level, at the county level. When I first met him, he was working for the state of Ohio on the NFIP side, and then he was over on the mitigation side, and he did spend some time in the private sector. So let's welcome, and as all of you know, he's been very involved with ASFPM for many years. He's been committee co-chair, vice board chair, and the past chair.
Okay. Thank you, Seal. Good morning, colleagues. I am very excited to be here and actually present on this topic because I have talked incessantly about this to our chapters, I think, for at least the last 6 months or the last year or however long we've had Biggert Waters and Grim Waters and those things. And so what I want to talk today is on NFIP reform and how that may be changing the paradigm, the way we manage floodplains, and the way we manage flood risk, and also some of the things that I've heard from you in terms of what's on your mind, what are some of the challenges, what are some of the drivers, and so forth. What I really like about being last on this particular panel is I think Dave framed out some big strategic issues, and one of the things that Dave said that I think is key, 2017 is a few years away, but we're already starting to think about NFIP reform. So I like how you said that, Dave, about laying the groundwork and a platform on which we're building. And then, of course, we had Gene up here, who, as a local floodplain manager, is applying an array of tools, an array of mitigation options, floodplain management options, and those things. And I call you the floodplain manager of the future, man. I mean, I think in terms of where this profession is going, especially on the state and local level, there's a lot of things to learn that way. So let me see, maybe I'm hitting the wrong button. We go to the next slide. Oh, I was pointing it. So I love, those of you, I don't know if you get the Natural Hazards Observer, but Rob Pundham is one of their illustrators there, and he's just fantastic. He's been doing this for mitigation and flood management for a long time. And I think this is especially appropriate, especially post-flood insurance reform. My gosh, how many of you are feeling kind of dazed and confused about, 2 big reform acts in 3 years and trying to figure out, what's next? Or maybe just dazed and confused because it's early morning still. Well, some of the issues, when I've gone to chapter meetings and I've talked to folks, and I've gone everywhere from this area of the country down to the Gulf Coast to the Northeast and talking to people. And of course, an organization with 16,000 members, you think we're going to get consensus. No, not really. But I bring some of these quotes up that folks have told me because I think it also describes how we as an association try to frame and discuss these issues nationally. So I have floodplain managers that have said with the Reform Acts and some of the sky-high insurance rates and things like that, said, you know what, it's about time. About time folks pay their own way. And then there's some others who have said that the Biggert Waters is the worst legislation ever passed in the history of Congress. Now, I find that, thinking about all the things that maybe Congress has done, I find that maybe a little difficult, but that was again a perspective. So in terms of the impacts, they vary widely across the country. What I thought was interesting in the the Grim Waters debate is it was really a lot of the coastal concerns that were driving the issues. But if you're in a state that has a lot of old river towns, when you think about it long term, those may be some of the communities that are even more impacted because you don't have a very active real estate market as it is. Probably 95% of the structures in the entire community are pretty firm, and those are the ones that are targeted with the subsidy elimination. So again, you had reactions from, hey, it's killing our local real estate market, it's totally frozen up, to, what impact is it having? It really isn't having a lot of impact. But I think the other impacts, and this wasn't necessarily said to me directly, but what I felt from floodplain managers is that all of a sudden you've gone from being an individual that maybe all you need to do is understand where your flood maps are, issue permits, have a variance hearing once in a while, to really needing to know a lot more about the different aspects of the NFIP. You need to know about different mitigation techniques, about how flood insurance works. I mean, going into the flood insurance manuals and looking at the pages and pages of rate tables, that is not fun reading, folks. I recommend you don't do it. But when you're wearing your professional floodplain manager's hat, that's something you probably need to start doing because you need to understand some of those dynamics. I've had more than one floodplain manager tell me that they have, after NFIP reform has passed, that somebody would call them and look them up. Floodplain manager is usually not not the most popular local official in town. People aren't going to call you up to shoot the breeze necessarily. But after NFIP reform passed, they see this name floodplain manager. They call the phone number. And I mean, they are in tears. I had a lot of state and local officials saying, hey, we spent a half hour just getting people calmed down and then talking through some of these issues. And I had Tim Troutman, who's the coordinator of our mitigation pod in Charlotte, North Carolina, or Mecklenburg County, was saying to me, and Tim knows about these mitigation programs. He knows, just like Gene, he knows how to pull money from here and here and here. And he said, Chad, one of the things that's really tough about this is I can't point them to any solutions. I can't point them in a direction to do something to address their issue. And that really resonated with me because I think one of the things with flood insurance reform that Congress totally missed the boat on, that we are and will continue to advocate for, and it's a principle that Rebecca Quinn, those of you that know her, had drilled into my head from an early time, but when you start messing with the rates and you start dealing with those aspects, you have to have a commensurate mitigation function that can help out during that transition, because really this is a transition. At some point you start with some set of subsidized policies and you go to an area or to a status that you're more actuarially sound. So you transition from one point to the other. And instead what we have is legislation that passed that made all the changes on the actuarial soundness and did almost absolutely nothing on the mitigation side. And I think one of the real lessons learned, but I think we actually were predicting this, is that the new legislation, the 2014 legislation, was the only logical outcome that we knew was going to occur. Had we had better mitigation and those kinds of things, perhaps it would have made a difference. So at the state level, Bill Neckerman, our chair, he told me one time, he says, I go out and I do presentations, and I'm doing it to a lot of groups, to realtors now, to insurance agents, and I do one presentation and I get requests for 3 more. And so our state folks are pretty tired, but they also are working tirelessly in terms of doing things. But states are beginning to react to this new reality. In Florida, I think there's some recent legislation that passed to encourage private market participation in flood insurance. But that can also be not a great thing. I know in Massachusetts right now there's some legislation that's pending, or at least being discussed, that to limit the cost of flood insurance on a property owner, they want to pass a law to limit the amount of insurance a lender can require on a property. So, I mean, kind of think about that and take it to its logical conclusion in terms of, okay, we have a small, a short-term potential fix, but is it going to be at the expense of lenders saying, hey, you know what? I can't insure my risk. I'm not going to lend here anymore. So we have states that are getting involved, but that is going to demand a lot of keen attention by our 35 state chapters and floodplain managers such as yourself at the state and local level informing the maybe well-intentioned but bad public policy that could come. Flood mapping, that's something that is going to become even more important to the extent, and again, we'll see how things actually shake out when it comes to grandfathering and some of those issues. But the fact is, in a program where there's real ramifications in terms of future risk and those kinds of changes, good mapping, comprehensive mapping around the country is very important. I've had so many floodplain managers in the last year saying, and it kind of surprised me because I figured, okay, with rates going up, people are going to say, holy cow, get those maps as far away from me as possible. Dave and I, we were talking, and unfortunately, where Dave sits, he doesn't get to hear the good stories about flood mapping. All he gets to hear about are the complaints, the issues, the problems, and those kinds of things. But Dave, I promise you, I've had lots of floodplain managers say, we need good maps. And it is something that I think floodplain managers inherently get. I had a local official in the Southern California area talk to me about the value of not only good mapping, but the CTP program, and how they had several alluvial fans that were newly identified. They had some flood zones that shifted and took people out of the floodplain, but their net gain was over 1,000 people. And he said, I knew that we were successful with this program when my county commissioner, when talking to a property owner who was really ticked off that they were mapped in the floodplain, said, you know what, there are maps. We went through a scientific process and that's what we have. So good mapping is still a need and still a driver. And everybody in here, if you have a good mapping story, email it to the people at FEMA headquarters. I want you to make them feel good a little bit that the mapping is a good and integral part of the program. So now I want to shift, and instead of reflections of officials, I do want to talk about some options and actions that I think may play well in this space in terms of as we deal with flood insurance reform. From a property owner standpoint, there are a few things, but one of the things I think we've got to do as floodplain management community is start talking about mitigation in a little bit different way. This particular graphic came out of Sandy, and at least the story as I understand it out of the New Jersey JFO. And what I like about this comparison is you have the 10-year cumulative amount of premium for flood insurance if you were below BFE, at BFE, and several feet above. And the point is the difference between the 4 feet below and the 3 feet above is about $90,000 over 10 years. Folks, we can mitigate darn near anything for $90,000. So instead of talking about annual savings and those kinds of things, wouldn't it be a more effective argument to a property owner to say, you know what, in savings and flood insurance alone, you recoup your cost in 10 years. In terms of communities and states, being aware of mitigation grants, one of the mantras I always had in Ohio is I said, you know what, I don't care how much the funding level is, develop good project applications and maximize and do as many as you can because you never know what's going to happen. And now we have, FEMA, and Dave was just mentioning this, the PDM program for this year is going to get a nice surge of about $40 million. Boom, do you have a project? Is it shelf ready? Is it ready to be submitted? We've got to have the stockpile of those things to do that. But we've also got to start building our technical capability and advice because being a floodplain manager today, post-Biggert Waters, post-Grim Waters, is not the same as it was before. You are being asked to do a whole lot more, to have a whole lot broader knowledge base than you ever have before. But don't leave it to FEMA. I was talking to a few folks about some of the trends financially and everything in this country. Did you know we're in debt a lot in this country? And Congress isn't funding things like they used to. The point is states and communities have got to step up to the plate, and in fact, many of them have. And so you can have your own mitigation programs. You could have a state program. You could have a local program in terms of doing these things. Some of the higher standards, maybe the discussion used to be a 1-foot freeboard, but my gosh, on the coast when you see climate change and just sea level rise alone being between 2 and 6 feet, we're talking probably a 3 feet minimum is where the conversation should start. just two programs that always were kind of interesting to me. South Holland, Illinois, what I really like about that, a community that's under 30,000 people. Folks, South Holland, they actually run their own mitigation rebate program. They fund it. You do mitigation, you get up to $2,500 rebate on your project. I find that more recently I found in the state of Colorado, and this is wildfire mitigation, but could easily be done for flood mitigation, there's an income tax deduction for doing wildfire mitigation action. So how many of you at the state level have maybe worked or talked to your agency about having something like that as a mitigation program? The point is we can do a lot more at the state and local communities. We have a lot of communities that are doing that and doing some good things, but we're going to need to be stepping up because the federal resources, at least the way I see it in terms of the horizon, they aren't going to be getting better anytime soon. So as a body, as my colleagues, as floodplain managers, I have one of the best jobs in the world. I get to represent all of you. But as I talk to folks around the country and I hear about all these different stories, it is very clear that we have a responsibility that as a profession, we need to become more educated and more aware of these options. We need to not only be active in issuing the permits and working with the citizens and the development in those issues, we also need to be working upward and talking to our elected officials who are picking up the phone as well and saying, hey, floodplain manager, what do you think about this? How do we become more resilient? Folks, we've got to do that. We've got to step up to that challenge. And I think then we will have a lot more resilient course in the future than what we have today. Thank you.